Over the past few weeks, we've taken a look back at the Borderlands franchise from every game since Borderlands 1 all the way up to the pre-sequel. But today, we're coming full circle to take a look at the most anticipated game of the franchise. In the final chapter of Remembering Borderlands, we're going to be taking a look at Borderlands 3. So, releasing on the 13th of September 2019, Borderlands 3 is the highly anticipated continuation of Borderlands 2. This time round, it features as always 4 new Vault Hunters, however this time they have access to multiple action skills instead of just one. The first is Flak the Beastmaster, who can use his pets to dominate the battlefield. Amara the Siren, who wields multiple phase abilities much like the previous Sirens in the series. Mose the Gunner, who takes control of Iron Bear, a mechanized robot capable of taking out hordes of enemies at once. And finally, Zane the Operative, who possesses numerous gadgets perfect for controlling the fight in his favor. I'm often asked by new players what the 4 Vault Hunters' abilities can be described as, and all I can really explain to them is that the 4 Vault Hunters are basically a mashup of every previous Vault Hunter in the series. So with that out of the way, I think it's time to do what we've done since chapter 1 of the series, and that's a quick story recap. So after a recruitment call is set out by the Crimson Raiders, the new team of Vault Hunters accept it and are taken to a location on Pandora where they meet Claptrap. Soon after being introduced to Lilith, who is now the leader of the Crimson Raiders following Borderlands 2, they join them in their journey across the stars to defeat the evil Calypso twins. The twins consist of Tyreen, a siren capable of leeching the life and power from any living being, and Troy, her lesser powerful twin brother, who is actually a siren himself due to Borderlands-y stuff happening to him when they were in the womb. So after Tyreen relentlessly saps Lilith of her siren powers just as the Raiders are about to set off to Sanctuary 3, Lilith is helped on board as the Vault Hunters set off across the stars. And for the first time since pre-sequel, Borderlands 3 opens up tons of new planets for us to venture off to. With this, we are first taken to Promethea, where we meet up with Lorelei and with her help track down Atlas CEO Reese. Reese then helps us track down various different things until we possess the Promethea Vault Key. After obtaining the key with the help of Maya, a returning character from Borderlands 2, and also Ava, her new sidekick, we reach the Promethea Vault and defeat the monster inside. However, just before we can make our escape, the Calypsos show up and once again do some leeching, this time by turning Maya into a pile of siren sand. Afterwards, the Vault Hunters travel to Eden 6 where they meet with the Hammerlock family, and after they finally obtain the key after some very long and drawn out gameplay, they'll fight the monster of Eden 6, and that is the Grave Ward. And then after Grave Ward is defeated, the Calypsos once again do some siren stuff by stealing Mrs. Patricia Tannis and taking her to Pandora. So after tracking down and saving Tannis aboard the Agonizer 9000, we find out that she's actually a siren, a discovery that had been speculated since the events of Borderlands 1. Once returning to Sanctuary 3, Troy reveals that he is going to use the moon as the key to open the Great Vault on Pandora, so we need to go and of course stop him. And then after finally killing Troy Calypso at the Great Vault, we learn via Tyreen Calypso that we aren't actually at the Great Vault itself, because the real vault is Pandora. This was a huge plot twist, only furthered by Tyreen revealing her true intentions. She wants to reawaken the Destroyer from Borderlands 1. Just as the Vault Hunters think they're doomed, they receive a call from Mr. Typhon Delian, the first Vault Hunter who is residing on the planet of Necrotafeo, a planet that was once considered a myth. So after setting a course for the mysterious planet, the Vault Hunters meet with Typhon, where he reveals that he possesses a machine which can close Pandora and stop Tyreen. Along the way though, Tyreen reveals that she is actually the daughter of Typhon and shows no mercy later on, as during the closing of the vault, Tyreen relentlessly murders her father, stopping the vault from being closed. So in order to stop Tyreen, the Vault Hunter faces off with her in the finale of the game, where Tyreen awakens and is consumed by the Destroyer, thus turning her into the Destroyer itself, which is somehow smaller than the Borderlands 1 Destroyer. After defeating Tyreen, Lilith gets her powers back, but we soon learn that the vault is still going to open regardless, so Lilith with her powers back nobly launches herself into the moon in order to seal off the key and stop Pandora from opening. And yeah, I tried to make that description of the story a lot quicker, but honestly, that's nigh impossible, and funnily enough, the story of Borderlands 3 would become one of the biggest criticisms about the game, as you'll find out later. But Borderlands 3 did have a lot to live up to. Being the follow-up from Borderlands 2's story, and with so much hype built around it, Gearbox had a huge weight to lift with the game being announced. So when it finally launched, myself with others were extremely happy to see the vast amount of quality of life changes the game had added. First of all, currency and ammo suddenly became auto pickups, which made the game a lot less tedious to play as a whole. Ammo vendors now showed you the item of the day without having to enter them, along with a buy all button that was outside of the machine, which would allow you to totally fill up your ammo reserves. Movement has also been a huge part of Borderlands since the start, and that's why in Borderlands 3 the addition of sliding and mantling was added in and works flawlessly. And speaking of things that have been another huge part of Borderlands, we have the loot system, and that's why in Borderlands 3 players can store hundreds of items inside of their banks and also gain access to the lost loot machine. This made it so that if you ever lose a valuable item during boss farming, it will get sent to the lost loot machine for you to collect later on. These changes alone instantly made Borderlands 3 way more fun to play and only helps the game in the long run. Also, for the first time ever, players are now given their own living quarters in Sanctuary, where they're now able to display loot they've farmed on the walls, place trophies, and their bank is directly accessible within the room as well. The golden chest too was overhauled, now allowing for it to drop legendaries as opposed to just purple tier max. And on this never-ending list of amazing things the game added, storage deck upgrades were switched from an iridium purchasable to a money purchasable, although in my opinion I would probably prefer them if you could buy them with both, but to say Borderlands 3 definitely added a ton of things to the core gameplay loop would be an understatement. And this showed as the game sold over 5 million copies just 5 days after release. Now honestly, I could go on and on about other new additions that the game added, but I do think it's more important that we just outline the most important things rather than the smaller changes. So let's talk about arguably the largest addition to Borderlands 3. Mayhem Levels. Mayhem Levels are an endgame leveling system unlocked by completing the story just once. They basically serve as OP levels from Borderlands 2, however you don't need to clear any level of challenge like the Digistruct Peak in order to progress in tiers. Mayhem Levels are a very messy thing to talk about, so I'm going to try and avoid anything that was quickly changed by Gearbox when I talk about them. However, the biggest issue with Mayhem Levels that I can't not discuss is the scaling issues that they introduced at launch. Now granted, the Borderlands series has always had some form of scaling issue, but when Mayhem Levels dropped, they were a total mess whether or not we're referring to loot scaling or enemy scaling. It just seemed like no matter what Gearbox did with Mayhem Levels, something was always broken. If you wasn't dealing damage to enemies, then the enemies were dealing too much damage to you, and if loot wasn't dropping, then it was dropping way too much. It was a huge mess, which I'm often glad newer players won't have to experience to the same degree as players did at launch, because honestly, Mayhem totally shattered BL3's endgame when it dropped. This ultimately led to what I like to call the Mayhem Apocalypse, which drove tons of fans away from BL3, dividing the community, and at launch it pretty much broke BL3. Suddenly, this hype train that we had all been aboard for so long was starting to get derailed as the community began bashing the game rather than enjoying it. Gearbox, however, did all that they could do to prevent this from being a mainstay, as they would release patch after patch in order to fix it, but sadly the damage was already done. Now believe me, the game did not die by any means. Even though half of the player base disappeared, there was still a huge amount of people playing the game post launch, and Gearbox was still loyal to those people. This is where free content drops began to rain down upon us even when we didn't ask for it. Gearbox was clearly sorry, and they made their best attempts to show that. Now since there is a lot of negatives to go through on this game, let's let's mix it up a bit and throw in some positives. I want to take a second to talk about the mailing system, a brand new addition which would allow players to send items directly to their friends through the pause menu. Not only did this make sending gear to friends extremely easy, but Gearbox also thought of solo players by making numerous quests and challenge rewards give you different guns and different skins and just so much cool stuff. And I know it's not a huge deal, but I just personally found it so awesome how Gearbox thought of their solo community before adding in a feature. It is just something that really stood out to me as a whole. And another feature that I feel not enough people took note of is the change to make your bank accessible by each character, allowing you to transfer gear between them a lot easier. It just ties in with all the rest of the quality of life changes, which I think just really adds to, again, the replayability of the game. Now, I want to talk about another part of BO3's lifespan, which I felt drastically hurt it at launch, and that's the issue of dedicated drops. Now, you may remember in Chapter 3 we spoke about pre-sequel's Iwajira grinder loop due to the low amount of dedicated drops and farmable bosses in-game. Well, you might be surprised to find out that this same issue persisted almost exactly in the same way when BO3 dropped. You see, when Borderlands 3 released, it ultimately had no dedicated drops, and I know to newer players today that may seem crazy as the game is filled to the brim with them, but really, at release there was barely even a few handful of dedicated drops, and even when there was, they mainly came from rare spawns, which by the way were really rare. It took multiple months for Gearbox to finally fix them, but yeah, rare spawns at launch felt extremely unfair, and ultimately it often made farming the enemy rarer than farming the weapon itself. So much like pre-sequel, in order to combat these issues, players found an easy guaranteed spawn boss with a high chance of dropping gear as their source for legendary loot. The moment players found out that Grave Ward was an extremely easy to farm boss and had an insanely high chance to drop upwards of 5 legendaries per kill, they began farming him non-stop. This right here, in my opinion, is where Borderlands 3 went catastrophically wrong, as the gameplay loop very quickly mirrored the Iwajira era of pre-sequel. And despite all of the changes Gearbox made, or even after adding the events and takedowns, players just would not let off on Grave Ward. They farmed him over and over and over again, until eventually they just got bored. It didn't matter what enemies Gearbox gave drops to, or even what content they added, because by then players already had virtually everything they needed, since level caps didn't become a thing for 6 months. Which means for half of Borderlands 3's lifespan, players had almost nothing to strive for. And this right here is ultimately what caused BO3's downfall, in my honest opinion. The free content was fun, the takedowns, the bloody harvest, the DLC, it was all really fun stuff. But none of that mattered, because as far as half the community was concerned, they had already got their game time in. In fact, it got that bad that even content creation became a struggle for BO3, as there was really nothing useful to cover. And even though I constantly rant and rave about the addition of classic style raid bosses, I can't help but feel like for the first half of BO3's year 1, they wouldn't have saved the game any more than a level cap would have. Now, before we move on, I think we should just touch on something that we brought up in the story recap earlier. One of the biggest complaints I see about BO3 from reviewers to players alike always seems to be the same sort of thing: the story. So honestly, I really don't know where to start here. I don't want to touch on the Calypsos again, as I've already done so, and I really don't want to explain the story either. And I think this alone just goes to stand as a main factor in why people hated the story of BO3 so much. Even explaining it or just telling people about it is quite frankly boring and just really complicated. The story of Borderlands 3 is long, drawn out, padded beyond your wildest imagination, and honestly, it just sucks. To think we went from Borderlands the pre-sequel, one of the most hated games in the series, yet still having one of the best stories of all of the games, to these guys? It's just laughable to say the least, especially when you realize that at first Gearbox were planning on having Jack return as the villain of the game. And even though I totally understand that players on one half just didn't want Jack to come back, I still feel like overall the reception would have been better in general, and this just goes to show as DLC 1, aka the Jack DLC, is still one of the best of the 4 so far for most players. And considering that as it stands right now, TVHM has little to no impact on gameplay, it really just doesn't give players a reason to replay the story of 3. It's a long drawn out process with a messy convoluted story which only makes players bored and confused rather than happy and excited. So from the messy story to the broken farming loops and the horrible scaling at launch, Gearbox ultimately left little for the fans to enjoy. So you have to ask yourself, what happened next? Well, for some players, that was ultimately it. They left the game and they haven't returned since. And then you have players like myself and many others still holding on to hope and pushing for change, trying to make the game better every day as Gearbox continues to buff and fix things around the clock. And honestly, I think that's the issue with Borderlands 3. It's a project. A project which, whether you like it or not, wasn't ready to be released in September of last year. Compare the Borderlands 3 of this year to last year's on a playability scale, and the changes are just drastic. So it's hard not to be excited for a year 2 of content, but also difficult not to be terrified of one also, as the events of year 1 on the first half could very well repeat themselves if Gearbox aren't careful. But I want to remain hopeful, as the game still means a lot to me and a huge amount of the community, even after everything. And speaking of the community, well, let's take a look at what the things you guys liked the most were. I got quite a few answers for this one, so let's just briefly touch on all of them for a second and try not to get too distracted. So one of the things that you guys like is the addition of a new element, and this comes in the form of radiation. And even though cryo is in the game returning from pre-sequel and is one of the things people like, radiation is somewhat different. The radiation element is pretty similar to fire or corrosive in the same sense that it will damage enemies over a period of time, but what actually makes radiation different is that nearby enemies are affected by it as well. Also, when the radiated enemy dies, it will explode, causing anyone around it to be inflicted with radiation also. And even though radiation isn't my favorite element, I will say that it is a cool one nonetheless. Furthermore, while we're talking about the new additions, it would be an absolute travesty to not talk about the brand new addition of anointments. Anointments are a new feature on items which can provide certain buffs to your player. For instance, you can find a fire weapon and also have it deal cryo damage each time you activate your action skill, or you can make it so that after using your action skill, you'll gain the ability to lifesteal. I feel like anointments were and still are a very great feature and ultimately added a lot to the replayability of the game. However, the new addition did also ruin a lot of things in the game as well. You guys remember how earlier we spoke about the Mayhem Apocalypse and how it was almost impossible to survive? Well, the only thing that made that somewhat bearable and survivable was the addition of anointments into your build. But instead of Gearbox totally revamping and properly balancing Mayhem mode, they instead went the easy route and increased anointment drop rates. So since you pretty much needed anointed gear to survive Mayhem mode, this meant that players no longer wanted base rarity weapons. And because of this, players then became frustrated and angry with the amount of anointed drops in the game compared to normal drops, resulting in Gearbox making anointments guaranteed in the higher Mayhem levels of Mayhem mode. This right here, in my opinion, is a huge flaw and ultimately killed the legendary rarity as a whole, as Gearbox no longer cared for it feeling special, but rather making it a foundation to add anointments onto. And I know it's going to be a hard pill to swallow for most, but I really did prefer the game before Mayhem 2.0, when farming for anointed gear felt fun and rewarding. Now it just feels like a normal thing to do, which shouldn't be the case for such a brand new prestigious addition which is is basically needed to survive the higher levels of the game. And also, while we're on the subject of weapons, I just want to talk about the gunplay of Borderlands 3, because with the addition of a new engine, it was bound to change. The gunplay in this game is so good. Every gun feels so nice to use, and I love everything about them. I will say that for me personally, I do feel like the snipers feel a lot less impactful than the BL1 snipers, but then again, BL2 and pre-sequel also shared this trait, so I can kind of give them a pass on that. But everything else just feels so damn clean, pistols being one of them. They really took a look at gunplay in this game to see how they could improve it, and that to me just stood out from day one as soon as I started playing the game. And when you think that this is something Gearbox have struggled with since Borderlands 1, you can't help but give a huge props to them for it. Now, when it comes to talking about negatives of the game, there is a line to draw. Since most of the game is largely still being buffed and worked on today, I want to leave a lot of potential discussions out of this video. I know there is a lot more you guys want me to talk about, and I know that I'm gonna hear it in the comment section, but I am not here to make this an assassination piece. I'm here to review the history of the game. And for the most part, despite year one being filled with issues, drama, lack of balancing, and endgame in general, they tried their best to maintain a very hard to please player base, dropping free content left and right, patching bugs, balancing weapons, and one could just argue that if the game was finished in the first place to begin with, then none of this would have had to happen. But I want to counter that argument by saying this: despite everything that had hit them this year, from the pandemic to the broken launch to the sheer amount of pressure from the community, Gearbox could have just given up entirely, leaving the game to fester in a pool of its own sorrow. Instead, they took initiative and weathered the storm, trying to fill some incredibly huge boots in order to please the very fan base who for the most part gave up on them. I can understand not being happy with them, but to refuse any kind of respect for their dedication just shows flat out disrespect for the hard work they've clearly been trying to put into what ultimately is their biggest game to date. So, on that note, I think we're going to end the video here. And I know this video is going to be a double-edged sword for most of you, as we covered a lot more negatives than positives, but I have to remain transparent and honest in these videos. However, with DLC 4 now released and year 2 approaching quickly in the horizon, I can't wait to come back next year to follow up the start of what is sure to be the great story of Borderlands 3. Thank you guys so much for watching Remembering Borderlands. Just before we end the video, I want to ask your opinions on something that's been prodding me for some time now. If you're familiar with my channel, you may remember that I also have a series called Borderlands Theory Crafting, where we discuss possible additions of changes to the game that could have or should happen. But seeing the reaction to Remembering Borderlands has made me realize that not only should Theory Crafting return, but it should merge with Remembering Borderlands so that we can discuss the history of this franchise together. So let me know what you guys think. Would you like to see a chapter 5 of Remembering Borderlands? And if so, what would you like to see us cover next? Let me know in the comment section down below, and on that note, please take care of one another and have a nice day.